All right, hello everybody. Hi there. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Smart Towns program, Auto Industry History. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask the audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation, as is corroborated by the slide behind me. Our next program is Prescription Drug Disposal and Opioid Information, presented by Oakland County Health, which will be an in-person event on Thursday, April 4th at 7 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with Smart Towns, a lifelong learning program for everyone in the community, led by education organizations in Rochester, Rochester Hills, and Oakland Township, Michigan. Smart Towns offers lectures, presentations, and courses that introduce the participants to all aspects of the topic and are presented by experts in their respective fields of study. Without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Chris Maliszewski.
Service announcement concerning the dangers of these gizmos. As we know, the technology has completely run rampant, and the real dangers are things that are running in the background that you don't know what they're doing, and they can cause you a lot of problems. Last January, my wife was out shopping for clothes to take advantage of the big sales. I'm at home minding my own business. I get a text and a selfie. She's wearing a new pair of slacks, and this selfie is showing me her wearing the slacks, and the text says, "Do these slacks make my butt look big?" Now, I have been married for more than a minute. I know the answer to that one. So I type in, "No." The phone autocorrects to "moo." Okay? So be careful. And I'm happy to report I've made a full recovery. It's always good news. Okay, my name is Chris Maliszewski. Thank you for coming, appreciate it. They gave me a description of being an automotive car enthusiast, and I am. I really love cars ever since I was a little kid. I don't know why. My parents treated cars as an appliance, but I got very interested, particularly in later years of history. And it's complicated. Complication in history is a terrible thing. But we'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm not an official historian. I'm not a researcher. I'm just a car nut, okay? So let's just, and I'll answer to car nut or gearhead, motorhead, whatever you like, okay? When my wife and I travel, I have visited many car museums all over the country. And boy, what a variety of things have been produced. Some of them downright scary, okay? But there were some that were very successful. And the number one car that put America on wheels was the Model T Ford. Phenomenal, changed the world. I mean, it's a big deal. Okay, so we want to talk tonight about Childe Harold Wills, who was Henry Ford's right-hand man. All right, let's talk a little bit about reporting history. And this is, I have run across this, oh my goodness, for years and years and years. And the number one misconception, and this is information that has been around for 120 years, Henry Ford invented the car. 100% incorrect. In fact, this has been such a problem that this plaque is the one that is in front of Henry Ford's quadricycle in the Henry Ford Museum. The curators of the automotive section put in the words, Henry Ford invented this car, not the car. Thank you. Okay, they tried their best. Another one was Henry Ford created the Model T. No. He could not create something that good all by himself. There were many people involved, and we'll get into, and that's the purpose. His child, Harold Wills, was his right-hand man, and there were many other people, very important people, who have just kind of fallen out of the spotlight. And if it wasn't for them, there would be no Henry Ford. Okay? Okay, so here he is, child Harold Wills. Born in 1878, he died, unfortunately, very early, 1940. He was an artist as a child, an automobile pioneer, a fabricator, inventor, machinist, master mechanic, metallurgist. This guy changed the world of automotive with his metallurgical skills. He was also a scientist and flat out a genius. Harold passed away. He had a bad fall in his home just before Christmas. And he suffered a very bad concussion. He was rushed to Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. He was treated for a concussion, but what the attending physician didn't know was that he was a serious diabetic, and he wasn't treated for that. He slipped into a coma, and we lost him at age 62. Okay? So, child Harold Wills was deeply involved in the development of all the cars before the Model T. Now, how many people knew that Henry and Company, Ford Motor Company, was building cars before the Model T? Yes. Okay, number of cars, okay? Every one of those cars was designed by Wills, including the engines, okay? Guy was brilliant. Here's another one. This is a favorite. Henry Ford installs the first moving assembly line for mass production of the Model T. Sure, December 1st, 1913, he did it all in one day because it all came in a big box from Amazon. Now, this development time, along with many people, took 4 solid years to get it to work, and then it was subject to continuous improvement. Henry wanted to have the cheapest and best car available, and he had all kind of ideas in his head how to do this, and he was very good at it, as was all of his people who developed the assembly line. Okay, now this one has been batted around for quite some time. Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, so long as it is black. Okay, this applies to a certain span of years for the Model T, starting in 1914. And this has been just general knowledge, and I never really questioned it because it sounded like something Henry would say. Well, a few years ago, the nice people at the Benson Ford Research Center issued a press release that said, "We have no record whatsoever that Henry ever said that." I'm like, okay, now what? Okay, so now I got to do the deep dive. Now, Henry did say this, okay, but I want to read his quote exactly. Henry had co-written a biography in 1922, My Life and Work, where he outlines everything he did and why he did it. It's a very good book, actually. But he describes in 1922 what went on in a sales meeting 13 years earlier in 1909. And his salespeople were beating him up. They said, "We want more models." Model T was selling like hotcakes. "We want different models." Henry said, no, not going to happen. Yeah. So this is his quote. "Therefore, in 1909, I announced one morning, without any previous warning, that in the future, we were going to build only one model. That model was going to be Model T, and that the chassis would be exactly the same for all cars. And I remarked, any customer can have a car painted any color he wants, so long that it is black. Later years, Henry denied saying this for reasons unknown. Okay, the all-black Model T started in 1914, okay? Purely a cost savings measure, right? Model Ts were dipped in paint, they were brushed, they were mopped, they were hosed. Anything to get the paint on the car, get it to dry, and get it onto the line, okay? So it was good paint. And for the time, it was really good paint, okay? So again, everything Henry wanted was durable, cheap. Cheap was the buzzword, okay? And then everybody asks, why black? Another story that has been around for many years. Everybody said, well, he chose black because it dried faster than any other color. A lot of people have written, well, if pink dried faster, we'd have 15.5 million pink Model Ts. But it is just not true, okay? The colorant or pigment in paint determines the color, not the drying time. It's all the other chemicals in the paint that make it dry faster or slower, okay? Now, I did a deep dive into this, and if everybody is still awake by the time we get to the end, we can discuss in more detail about the paint. A lot of people have written that the paint came from Japan. No. It came from Akron, Ohio. Very simple. All right. It did not dry faster. Pigment has nothing to do with drying time. All right. Again, Childe Harold Wills, a metallurgist, invented vanadium steel. Completely wrong. If that was right, I would say that I was the original Polish guy who invented punchki. Okay? Not a ghost of a chance. Okay? Henry or Wills did not invent vanadium steel, and we'll get into more detail on that. Now, you don't find very much information about Harold, because he was Henry's right-hand man. He designed just about everything in cooperation with Henry. Henry had all kind of cool ideas. But when people mention or you read something about Wills, they always say he was Ford Motor Company's first employee. And that is simply not true. Henry had two companies prior to the Ford Motor Company, okay? Wills was the first employee at the Detroit Automobile Company, okay? He was hired as a draftsman. That company failed, and he left and moved with Henry to the Henry Ford Company, the second failed company, again as a draftsman. The third company was the Ford Motor Company, where he was the third person hired. Now, that is really a great Trivial Pursuit question. Some people make it important. I don't know why. All right, let's see what we can do to move forward. Here we go. Okay, we've seen Mr. Wills. Now his parents. John Carnegie Wills was actually born in Canada. His mother, with her parents, emigrated from England. They were in Pennsylvania. Harold's grandfather came from Scotland. The family moved from Canada to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Harold was born on June 1st, 1878. They moved again to Detroit in 1885 to 220 12th Street. Harold was the third and only surviving child of John and Mary, having lost an older brother and sister in 1875. The 1880 census John C. Wills as a train dispatcher and Mary as keeps house. I would like to hear that terminology today. Whew. Okay. Harold's name. Boy, this is tough. Whoops. Harold's name. The word child, either with an E or without, comes from the Old English killed, which means young lord. This was a nobleman's son, somebody very important, who had not yet attained knighthood or had not yet won his spurs. So in that time period, this was very important. If you were born of royalty, well, you showed up, you got a title, okay? That's, I guess, pretty much simple. Mary Wills chose this name because she enjoyed the poetry of Lord Byron, particularly Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, published between 1812 and 1818. Harold hated his name for his entire life. It caused him a lot of problems during his youth. He became an adept boxer because of it. He did everything he could to make people forget his first name, right? So, in the business world and working with Ford and others, he was C. Harold Wills or C.H. Wills, or informally as C.H. Now, in all of my reading, I've never come across anyone ever calling him Harry. And I don't know why. Maybe his wife did, but no, it was all about C.H. Okay, start of a career, or, early years. Here we go. Harold was very talented, very, very brilliant as a child. He attended Detroit public schools. He read trade magazines and journals, took night courses, chemistry, mechanical engineering, metallurgy. He was quoted as saying he didn't like books very much. If it's in a book, it's at least 4 years old, and I don't have any use for it. Okay? Things at the turn of the century were moving very quickly. Okay? Progress, the machine age, holy mackerel, nobody could keep up. Harold learned a lot from trial and error. His father provided him with hands-on skills of fabrication, use of machine tools starting at age 12. His father was a railroad mechanic and master machinist, so after school he would let Harold into the shop, teach him how to operate machines. Harold would make projects and became very, very good. He also loved art, mainly cartooning and calligraphy. He made a little bit of side money hand lettering what were called calling cards, which was kind of a precursor to business cards, okay? And he was very good at it. His skills were just unbelievable, okay? And we'll see that he used these skills later on when he worked for Ford Motor Company. Family moved again to Trumbull Street in 1895, and at 17, Harold had to make a decision. Did he want to pursue a career in art or mechanics? Now this is a big turning point here. The start of his career. 17 in 1895, he served a 4-year apprenticeship at the Detroit Lubricator Company to become a tool maker. His father worked there as a manager. He became very good at it. He started at $7.50 per week with the promise of $10 per week once he completed the apprenticeship. He used these skills for the rest of his life. He was very good at it. Once he finished the apprenticeship, the salary increase didn't materialize. So he said, heck with you people, I'm going somewhere else. So he went to the Boyer Machine Company. His talents were recognized, and his starting salary was $18 per week. That's a pretty good jump. Management was so impressed, after 3 weeks, he was promoted to chief engineer and foreman at $27 a week. 3 months later, he was promoted to plant superintendent at $50 a week. Okay? Wow. Harold learned very quickly, talent, hard work, long hours paid off. He was known as a workaholic. He had a 400% salary increase in a very short time, and he did the popular thing, moved out of his parents' house and into the Plaza Hotel. Okay? That was a thing back then, I guess. Let's see. Okay, another big thing here. Age 21, he decided to get into cars. He had all this knowledge, wanted to put it into practice. He contacted Henry Ford, 15 years his senior. And we find out here that Henry was, when he did hire people, he hired young people, everybody younger than him. He wanted him to work as a part-time assistant. Henry and Harold talked at length, found out they shared many, many interests, boating, fishing, hunting, and above all, the automobile. Ford was working at Edison Power and Light as an engineer to keep the steam engines running, to keep the city of Detroit powered up. But he had, with his work, he had amassed sufficient financial backing to found the first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, August 5th, 1899. Harold, the first employee, was a draftsman. Henry was the superintendent. Now this is beautiful. Ford worked without pay, as did Harold. Okay? The investors gave them a place to work, bought them machinery, and off they went. But they both kept their day jobs and agreed to work together on the car early in the morning and late at night. Harold would arrive at 5 a.m., work until 7, go to Boyer to work, and then return to work on the car at 7 o'clock until midnight. Now, that isn't a workaholic. That's the true definition. They worked on various cars and Henry Ford's first race car, the Sweepstakes. But this did not go over well with the investors. They wanted sellable cars. They wanted to get on that bandwagon because there were a lot of cars already in production at this time. Henry was late, okay? Henry had a big argument with the people. They did not like the idea of the race car, but Henry had his own idea. He thought that having a race car and winning a race would gain him a lot of popularity and attract even more investors, especially if he won. Auto racing was in its infancy at this point, okay? Cars were not ready. The company said, goodbye, Henry, you're out of here. 1901, Henry's done. That company lasted 7 months. That was it. Now, this, to me, is really, really important. This meeting with Henry Ford, they hit it off immediately, okay? Wills came in with knowledge, and he could do a lot of things that Henry couldn't, okay? Henry is 36 years old at this point. He's late to the game of manufacturing automobiles. I mean, he's really late. There's already cars on the road. Henry has an 8th grade education, and he has experience from working odd jobs, particularly working in a machine shop, where he did learn quite a bit, okay? Henry possessed an uncanny ability for things mechanical. Everything from watches to steam engines. He could look at a problem and repair it very quickly. It was just magic with him, okay? He was truly a genius in this regard. And another facet of Henry's genius is he was what people called a natural economist. He could look at a part or a procedure and immediately figure out a better, cheaper way to do it, okay? But he always kept quality in mind. That he did not want to build anything cheap. But finally, Henry started getting frustrated. He had been tinkering around with cars, starting with the quadricycle and various other cars. He actually built 4 cars after the quadricycle that never went anywhere, and he's getting frustrated, okay? So he finally figured out he cannot build a car by himself. It's just impossible. Okay, so he says, well, we're going to start hiring some smart people, okay, people who are going to teach me and help me how to do it. Now, the one critical flaw that Henry had was that he could not read a blueprint. He could not make a drawing. He couldn't even sketch, okay? People that he worked with called him a cut and try engineer, okay? So he could not sketch something out, check to see if things fit, do anything. No, it was trial and error 100% of the time. And that slowed the process down tremendously, okay? When he hired Wills, this just absolutely changed everything, okay? Harold could draw. Harold was a great communicator, okay? So once they got started, bystanders would watch these two work together, and they couldn't tell where Henry's ideas stopped and Will's began. These two were mind melded, okay? They were just a team that nobody could believe, okay? So I call this kind of a shared genius. So once Henry and Wills would agree on an idea, Harold would sit down, make a formal drawing, a working drawing, fully dimensioned, This was all Greek to Henry, and he would run a blueprint, and then he would either make the part himself or hand the blueprint off to a helper, and that person would make it, and that would generally be a machinist. In these early days, it was the machinists and draftsmen who were designing everything. Okay, there was no marketing department or anything like that. And this was all pretty much trial and error, and they really didn't have anything to go by. Now, this particular relationship is very important. This lasted for 20 years. Okay, and they were the best of friends. They were absolutely the best of friends because they could understand each other. Okay, well, this is again a huge step because this is the beginning of Henry's dream of the Model T, every man's car. Okay, very, very important. All right, let's talk about a little bit about some of the other people in the early days. Okay. We have a man you've probably never heard of, Oliver Barthel. He worked for a gentleman named Charles Brady King, who was an engineer in Detroit, who was designing engines. Okay, this was all a new craze. Internal combustion engines applied to cars, which made them unique, was a big deal. Everybody was doing it. Okay, the Dodge brothers were making engines already, although they weren't making cars. Another gentleman here, where I don't have him on the list. Oh well, okay. Anyway, Oliver Barthel worked for Charles Brady King as an assistant and a draftsman. He left to become Henry Ford's design engineer for engines, mainly on the race cars. And from 1901 to 1902, he, Wills, and Ford co-designed the sweepstakes race car, Henry's first racing car. Okay. Another man this is another very, very important relationship, James Couzens. Now, you know you have a legacy when they name a street after you, okay? James Couzens went on, once he left Ford, he became the mayor of Detroit for a number of years, and he also was a senator, okay? And he was a tough cookie. Oh man, this guy was a businessman's businessman, okay? He was destined to succeed in anything that he touched, okay? He was actually feared in the Ford Motor Company plant. The employees didn't like him. He was brutal, okay? He got along with Henry, and he controlled the money. That was the key thing, and he would not let Henry spend a frivolous nickel. Okay, if Henry had a good story or a good reason, he got the money. But Henry really did not have control of the money. Okay, John Dodge and Horace Dodge. Boy, here's a couple of characters for you. They were absolutely brilliant. These two guys, a couple of red-headed Irishmen, drank a lot, brilliant machinists and engine builders. Holy cow, these guys were something else. They owned a very large machine shop in the city of Detroit. They were building engines for Ransom Olds, for the Curve Dash Oldsmobile, which was Henry's #1 competitor. Mr. Olds made them pretty wealthy, okay? So long about 1902, they became believers and investors with Henry, and they signed a contract. So a lot of people don't know this, but the very earliest Ford cars had a complete Dodge Brothers powertrain, okay? Engine, transmission, rear axle, frame, suspension, steering, everything was made by the Dodge Brothers, okay? Really, these guys got along fairly well with Henry. There were problems. The Dodge Brothers were hiring unskilled people to make parts on a piecemeal type of thing, you know, to get paid by the part. And of course, the more parts you make in a day, the more money you make. And things started to get a little sloppy. Parts weren't fitting. They'd have a meeting. Henry would yell. Couzens would yell. The Dodge Brothers would go back, fix the problem, and in a couple days, everything's fine again. So they were pretty rough, though. They were pretty rough. Another unsung hero, holy cats, Walter Flanders. This guy was brilliant. He worked for a machine tool company that made precision machinery for Singer Sewing Machine Company and many others. He was very good at designing machines, and he was even better at machine processes, how to make a line to finish each part, each step all the way along, okay? Brilliant guy. Henry recruited him in 1906 as his plant manager. He was there for only 2 years, but he completely turned the Paquette Avenue plant upside down. He installed new machinery, new processes, new ways to do things. He even helped with the assembly of the cars, and we'll get a little bit into that a little bit later. But now we got to talk a little bit more about Henry and the first car company. There's two ways to make cars. You're either a manufacturer, where you make all your own parts or most of your own parts, or you're an assembler, all right? In the early days up until about 1906, Henry was an assembler. He bought most of his parts, okay? Just didn't have the capacity yet or the money to start buying all the machinery to make his own parts. He certainly had one of the best designers in town, and you know, all the cars were drawn by Wills. So it's very important. But where did all this happen? This was a very important factor too. There's an area in Detroit called the Milwaukee Junction. I don't know if you've heard about it or not, but this was a heavily industrialized area north and east of downtown Detroit. It would be just east of what we call the new center area today. So if you can picture I-75 going south, I-94 going east and west, it would be in the northwest quadrant. It's 3.5 square miles. There was a ton of things going on at the turn of the century, okay? Number one, they called it the Milwaukee Junction because it was a meeting place of two very large rail lines, okay? We didn't have trucks to move things around. Everything moved by train at this time. So I have to read this because I wouldn't want to be the guy that had to paint this on the side of a boxcar. It was two big railroads, the Grand Haven and Milwaukee Railway and the Chicago, Detroit, and Canada Grand Trunk Junction Railroads. Whew. Very important, though, for transportation. Now, in this area at the time, all sorts of things were being made. First and foremost was the stove industry. The Michigan Stove Company and the Garland Stove Company, they produced 10% of the heating and cooking stoves for the world. This was a center of stove making, okay? So now we have people who know how to make castings, people can work with cast iron, experts in making cast iron products, okay? There was very fine machinery being made here for the food packing industry, canning, okay? Very precision stuff. The carriage industry was still big, okay? We're making wood body carriages, horse-drawn wagons, all of this is going on. Right in the Detroit River, we were building ships, okay? Right off of Jefferson, right just downtown. It's unbelievable, okay? We were also making trolleys and trolley systems, okay, for cities, electric. We're making bicycles, railroad cars, okay? Raw materials were easily accessed either by rail or by ship. There were foundries and machine shops everywhere. So this was what they called the cradle of the automobile industry. A lot of people call it the birthplace. No, it is really not. There were many cars being produced across the country long before Detroit. There were a lot of cars made in Indiana, believe it or not. Some really good cars. Okay, Walter Flanders. One thing that Walter Flanders created, and along with James Cousins, who was the business manager, he worked very, very closely with the Ford dealer network to match car production to market demand. Okay, it was the first. I have no idea what happened to that today. Okay, you look in the website of any car dealership and you will see that they have over 1,000 cars in stock just sitting there. okay? So this is a big mystery to me. I've been in the business for 40 years and I never figured that out. Okay, it's a little crazy. All right, we'll go to Joseph Gallum, a brilliant guy, draftsman engineer that was hired actually by Wills to work in the Ford Motor Company, and just absolutely brilliant guy. He could create drawings just like as well as Wills, okay? Very good guy to have around. Edward Spider Huff. Nobody knows where the name Spider came from, but his middle initial was S. He was a self-taught electrical genius. He invented all of the electrical systems for all of the Ford cars, okay? Magnetos, basically. His real crowning achievement was the flywheel magneto, okay? This was, I don't want to get into too much technical stuff here, but every engine has a big flywheel. He put magnets on it. He could create an electrical field with the engine running. And the Ford was the very first car that didn't need a battery to run. It ran just on the magneto. Brilliant stuff, okay? This is what happens when you hire the best. Ed was with Ford for many, many years, off and on. There was some indication that he never really was a Ford employee. He was a contractor. But he worked with Henry on the quadricycle. He designed and installed the electrical system for Henry's quadricycle. So he's been with Henry for a long, long time. Alexander Malcolmson was one of the biggest investors and a true believer in Henry. He was involved in all of these escapades. He owned a very, very large fuel company, mainly coal and wood, because that's how homes were heated back then. Really good guy and a firm believer in Henry. C.J. Smith was a master machinist and test driver of the cars. They actually did that back then. He worked absolutely tirelessly on the Model T. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about the secret room where the Model T was developed. He lived there. Charlie Sorensen, also known as Cast Iron Charlie, was a Danish immigrant, absolute master of making castings, patterns and everything. Henry would have an idea, the next day he would have a part. Okay, he was that good. He was very fast. Outside of the Paquette Avenue plant, out in a field, they had a little foundry. So he could go out there in the middle of the night and make whatever he needed. He was very, very good. John Wandersee was a draftsman and machinist and a personal friend of Will's. Another brilliant guy. He worked for Henry Ford for 40 years, was at the time in the early days the longest running employee, okay? So these, again, I don't want to pick on Henry, but Henry needed help. And that was the only way he could do it, was to hire really, really smart people. And he succeeded. It was a part of his genius, okay? Okay, the Henry Ford Company, the second company, Wills is hired as draftsman. He gets a written contract this time. He actually gets money. Isn't that nice? Ford and Wills split $125 a month. But Harold was pretty smart. He wanted to continue with Ford, but wanted a stake in the company. Henry agreed, worked out a private oral profit-sharing agreement whereby he would receive 10% of his company dividends. So that was a really good thing for Henry to do. But Henry recognized his talents and wanted to make sure he wasn't going to go anywhere. This new venture was founded again by a group of stockholders. Henry and Harold produced one panel truck, but it was far from perfect. Much of the car work was interrupted by race car work. Oh boy, Henry had the racing bug. He really did. Progress was slow. This angered the investors. They called in a local engine builder and master machinist, Henry Leland. Another brilliant guy. Jeez, oh Pete. He was scary. He was the man, and I don't want to spoil it because I want to maybe use him as an example for another presentation. Brilliant man. He brought the idea of interchangeable parts to the automobile industry from other industries, okay? Once that happened, oh man, cars were so much easier to put together. There was no more trial and error and custom fitting. It all fell together, okay? Again, the investors were angry. They sent in Henry to have a conversation, or Henry Leland to have a conversation with Henry Ford. Stories vary. It could have been nasty. It could have been not so nasty. Leland looked over what Henry was doing, reported back to Malcolmson, and Henry got really ticked off, okay? Henry fought again and quit. Wills left with him. Henry Ford Company was dissolved March 10, 1902, after approximately 3 months. We start to see a little bit of a dark side of Henry. He really did not want to be told what to do, okay? Just pure simple, that is it, okay? But Henry Leland was called back and asked to salvage what Henry had started, meaning Henry and Wills. They had a few cars up and running, and they were actually the forerunner of the first car, the Model A of 1903. Henry went in, agreed, solved the problems, and the Cadillac Motor Car Company was founded by Henry Leland, okay, using a Ford body and chassis instead. Okay, Henry put his own engine in it, got rid of Henry's engine. All right. The car later became the Ford Model A and the Cadillac Model A in the same year in 1903. Okay? Okay. Reams and reams and reams of things have been published about the race cars. We're not going to get into that tonight. Again, we saw that, you know, this was not what the investors wanted. They wanted cars they could make money on. Henry was bitten by the racing bug, and he liked the idea because it got him a lot of free publicity, big time. It put him on the map in the automotive world. Oliver Barthel, we talked about him earlier, was hired by Henry to develop the engine. Wills, Ed Huff, John Wandersee, and a few other helpers worked on that car. Henry raced, won a big race here in St. Clair Shores on a horse racing track against Alexander Winton. What I would ask is how much time, and there's no recording of this, how much time did Harold spend on the race car versus the forthcoming Model A? Nobody really knows, okay? Again, I think Wills was pretty smart and tried to, you know, at least try to balance out the time, or they weren't going to go anywhere. They were not in the business to make race cars. So the very first car is on the bottom left there, the Sweepstakes, in its original form, untouched, unrestored. It has been in the Henry Ford Museum for a very long time. There's a lot of controversy about the 999. As you read this, it's all very confusing. Henry didn't help by confusing the names of the cars, but there were actually only two cars. There was the Arrow, the Red Devil, there was two, and then they were sold, and Henry bought one back, rebuilt it, and called it the 999 after a famous steam engine that was very fast. Okay? So that's as far as we're going to go with that because, whew. All right, now we have some proof that C.H. Wills worked on race cars. Henry decided, and this was the big thing of the time, who could go the fastest. And again, you know, here's another little historical note. Does anybody know when the first automobile race took place? The very first one. It's very simple. The very same day the second car was completed. It's a guy thing. All right, 1904, New Baltimore, Michigan, not very far from here. Henry personally drove the 999 with Ed Spider Huff at the throttle. A new land speed record was achieved, 91.37 miles an hour. The previous picture, you have a look, if you ever go to the Henry Ford Museum, look that car up and tell me if you would really want to drive it, okay? It was over 1,000 cubic inches and 4 cylinders. It had a top RPM of about 1,200, and it made boatloads of torque. It was all about torque, okay? But that was the design criteria for engines of the day: long bore, long stroke, very large bore. Okay, they were big thumpers. So anyway, Henry hired somebody to plow the snow into a long straight track into Lake St. Clair, Anchor Bay. A lot of people say it happened on Lake St. Clair. It did not. It was on Anchor Bay. And the man was supposed to spread cinders on the track to provide some traction. That idea failed miserably. They knocked the car over a couple of times trying to make this speed attempt. And they succeeded, 91.37 miles an hour. They did it again with similar results on January 12th, this time with an official from the American Automobile Association present to officially to record the run. Okay? This lasted only 20 days. Somebody beat it. But this was great publicity for Ford's new company. Harold was part of the crew, along with Clara Ford, a 10-year-old Etzel, Henry's only son, John Wandersee, Ed Spider Huff. Spectators included John Dodge, James Couzens, Alexander Malcolmson, the key players that we met a little earlier. Here's the Chesterfield Hotel, 1904, no longer existing. They sponsored the event and actually advertised it in the newspaper as auto racing. There was one car. Henry loved the muskrat dinner they served. I don't know about that. Okay, now we have the Ford Motor Company. 1903, this is where it really got started. And again, we have Henry and investors who he didn't really like. The second car built by the company was sold July 15th, 1903. Harold totaled the first one. A little accident out test driving it. Apparently he wasn't. Henry owned 25.5% of the stock in the new organization. He became president, controlling 19. Wills was not an investor, but was hired as chief engineer. And he also had a small group of draftsmen, about 2 or 3. He did not, he designed all the stuff, created a lot of the drawings, but things were getting pretty busy and he needed help. So he was smart enough to hire people to draw the parts out one by one to his design. Now, he was the main designer of the early letter cars. Now, here's a whole list, A, C, so on and so forth. And in the collector world, NRS is essentially the same car. These were the last cars before the one of Henry's favorite cars. The missing letters in these, the D never left Harold's drawing board. The E was a delivery truck. G, H, and I were prototypes that never left the building. But here's a good illustration of the first Ford car on the right and the first Cadillac Model A. Same car, different engine, different badges, okay? So that's what Henry left behind. That's what Henry Leland ran with. It worked. All right, another tremendous piece of history, the Ford logo, drawn by our unsung hero, C.H. Wills. He had drafting and art skills. This was the first rendition of the Ford logo. This was an early version because you notice the little curl in the F but near the O is not there. So he was still noodling around with it. This came from the Ford Motor Company archives. Had a few revisions, but we see it today. It's still used on the cars, okay? Another early logo was the word Ford with wings, the yellow arrow. That was a very popular thing to do back then. And the lower logo on the radiator was the final rendition. And that's the one we really see today, okay? Now, This type of script was very, very popular in the late 1800s. It's called Spencerian. It is not Henry Ford's signature. It is so often reported. It wasn't even close, okay? Now I have the ultimate trivia question. Look at that script. This script is very famous on another product dating back to 1885. The company exists today. Coca-Cola. That's it. Still in use, never changed it, okay? Now, I talked with the people at the Paquette plant. Their docents there are very, very nice people, very, very smart. I asked about this winged logo, and when did it disappear? Because now we have a car with both logos on it, which is a little odd, but the one that is stamped on the radiator shell appears on all the letter cars and early T's until they moved to Highland Park in 1910. That was the cutoff point. But my personal photo there, I go to a million car shows, that's a 1911 T. So what's going on here? Well, leftover stock. Radiator shell from a different car in the restoration process. You know, cars are like a big puzzle, okay, and a lot of parts are interchangeable. So that was supposed to be the 1910 cutoff, but nothing's perfect. All right, our hero gets married, okay? And Mabel Preston was his wife, June 16th, 1904. Henry was the best man, okay? They were that close. They were amazing. Wills then moved into an opulent waterfront home on Jefferson Avenue, meaning he had a home right on the Detroit River. He's getting pretty wealthy thanks to Henry at this point, okay? They had 3 children. First, a boy that sadly only survived an hour. Then they had 2 girls, Virginia and Josephine. And unfortunately, Josephine passed when she was only 4. Harold's marriage to Mabel lasted only 9 years. They divorced in 1913. With Harold's work ethic, she probably had a picture of him. That was about it, okay? That didn't last. Harold remarried in 1914 to Mary Coyne. They had 2 sons, John Harold and Child Harold Jr. Oh.
He hated it, so he gives it to his son.
You know, how many times did Junior say, "Thanks, Dad"?
Yeah.
Okay. But actually, in about 1970, they interviewed Harold Jr. and asked him about his name. And he said, it wasn't that bad. He says, I just did the same thing my father did. I never used it. I was Harold. Okay, Harold Jr. All right. They had a stepdaughter, too, from the second marriage. All right, this is the first Ford plant on Mack Avenue. This is where all the Model A's were built, very first car. Now, for all your car people, there was another Model A starting in 1928 to 1931. So they reused, and there's always confusion as to which Model A we're talking about. It was located on Mack Avenue in Detroit. Ford's primary investor was Alexander Malcolmson, the coal magnate. They rented a building, added onto it very quickly. Orders for the Model A were coming in fast and furious, and they needed room to build a car. There was a railroad siding right there, which was really great for bringing materials in and shipping finished cars out. They made 1,750 of these things. And they were pretty good cars. I mean, for the day, with materials and whatnot, boy, they were pretty rugged little car, and they were pretty cheap. And that was Henry's, the beginning of his dream. Unfortunately, the plant, the original building, which I thought would have been cool to preserve, burned down in 1941. But you can see a smaller version of it in Greenfield Village. Okay, so you get some sense, mainly the office area where Henry's office was and where Will's worked. Okay. Okay. here we go. Vanadium steel. This was the turning point. Harold's work changed the automotive industry. To this day, we are still using vanadium steel, mainly in sheet metal and a few other parts. Henry still had the racing bug. He just couldn't give it up. So between 1904 and 1906, Henry went back to racing, had zero success. There were you can't call them race tracks, but they were beaches. They ranged all the way from Florida all the way up to New Jersey, and everybody and their brother who had a car that ran was trying to do a land speed record attempt, okay? Unfortunately, here in Ormond Beach, many attempts. Alexander Winton was there. Olds was there with his car called the Pirate. There were many successes and sadly many accidents and deaths. 1905, Harold was in attendance with Henry. They examined a French racing car. Some people say they knew it was French. They believe it was a Peugeot. It had crashed and it was a wreck. Henry picked up a piece of steel, marveled at how light and strong it was. Oops, now Harold gets his next assignment. What is this stuff? Okay. Henry and Harold both agreed early that lightweight was a real bonus for a car. Still is today, but we don't seem to understand that. Working quickly, Harold found out that vanadium was the key ingredient. Harold discovered an English metallurgist named John Kent Smith was experimenting with vanadium, adding it to plain carbon steel to increase its strength since 1900. Harold contacted Kent Smith, who was actually working in the US, asked him to visit him in Detroit. They worked together for quite some time. Harold went to work learning and developing a new alloy steel to be used in Ford cars. He worked very closely with a very small steel mill, United Alloy Steel Company in Canton, Ohio. Harold spent a lot of time there experimenting, developing formulas, and they were suitable for use on Ford cars, starting with the Model N, just before the T. Okay? Vanadium steel would be used extensively in the T for frames, rear axles, engines, transmissions, allowing the car to weigh only 1,200 pounds. Cars of the day were monsters, and they were a plaything for the rich. So the bigger and the fancier they were, the bigger the engine they needed, and lightweight was not a consideration, except in Henry's world. The vanadium wasn't perfect. It had some faults, but Harold adjusted and everything turned out just fine. He then began studies on molybdenum steel. And when Wills later on developed his own car, he used molybdenum steel almost exclusively. But smart Harold patented all of his work on vanadium. Okay? Very, very important. Oops. Here we go. All right, we're going to get almost barely technical here. Vanadium was discovered in 1801. Mexican mineralogist Andres Manuel del Rio. He found this, wrote a big paper on it, shipped it to France for analysis. It was lost in a shipwreck. Here we go, 29 years later, it was rediscovered by a Swedish chemist, Nils Gabriel Selfström, who named it after Venatus, a Greek in Norse mythology, goddess of beauty and youth. English chemists Henry Enfield Roscoe isolated the metal in 1867. American chemists John Wesley Martin, Malcolm N. Rich made it 99.7% pure in 1925. Now here's the key thing. Vanadium began to be used in the manufacture of special steels in 1896. Wills did not invent vanadium steel. This has tortured me for a long time. I'd like to see people get credit for things, but no. It was a little sketchy on the information, but the beginning of it was either in France or in England, okay? and it was pretty special stuff. We still use it today. Most of it comes from South Africa, Russia, and China. We really don't have any here in the United States. 80% of it that is produced today is alloyed with iron to make a shock and corrosion resistant steel additive called ferrovanadium. Main use today, alloy for steel, making it light and strong. So let's talk a little bit, just very briefly, about making steel. You need a recipe, okay? You need a formula, recipe. And it's like making soup. Your basic stock is iron ore with scrap steel added, okay? You bring that to a molten state, which I don't think you can do in your kitchen, around 3,000 degrees. Now you follow your recipe and you add your ingredients, vanadium, nickel, chromium, molybdenum, and you have your soup. Is this easy to do? No, I with that one. Now, I tried to make soup from a recipe once, and all I managed to do was summon a demon. So, Mission Control has banned me from the kitchen forever. Okay, now, again, Harold did not invent vanadium steel, and importantly, neither did Henry Ford, although later on he took credit for it. He was real good at that. All right, Henry's favorite car, besides the T, and Henry's most hated car. Okay, the Model N. Oh my goodness, that little guy down at the bottom there, that was Henry's favorite. This was just a few models away from the beginning of the T, and that is what he wanted. A little buggy with a small engine, lightweight. Look, it only weighed 800 pounds, 15 horsepower, a Wills designed 4-cylinder engine and transmission, cost $500. So in 1906, was that a lot of money? Yes, yes. It was not yet ready for the common person, okay? And most people think that the first car to use the vanadium steel was the Model T. No, 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 no. It found its way into the NR and S. This was the biggest seller. This actually outsold the curved dash Olds, which was Henry's #1 competitor. Maybe later, if somebody is brave enough to ask me after the presentation, there's like Henry Ford and Ransom Olds were like distant cousins. They all had the same thought patterns. Olds wanted that little car, little single-cylinder curved dash model that you see in museums. Lightweight, simple to work on, and cheap, okay? They also shared a hatred of horses, okay? Both of them. What? Nothing to do with horses. Henry was raised on a farm and just hated those critters, okay? So maybe that was some of the inspiration to get into the cars, to replace that stupid horse. Okay. Now the N model was the biggest seller. Henry got really smart here, and he actually came up with this himself. For every popular models, every 10 N models, the dealers had to purchase one poorly selling K model. Okay, very clever. We still do this today, okay? You get a popular car, the dealers all want that car, but the manufacturer says, well, you gotta take some of these lumpies too, you know, we gotta sell those, they can't keep them standing around. So, okay, that has stuck today. Let's see, the Model K. Henry hated this car because Alexander Malcolmson forced it on him. Malcolmson's idea was completely polar opposite from Henry's. He did not want these little cars. The money was in the big cars, okay? This car was troublesome. It had a Wills designed 6-cylinder engine, made 40 horsepower, 2,400 pounds. Oh man, Henry was just beside himself. $2,500, okay? Was not a big seller. It was not a reliable car. It just didn't work out, okay? Nobody can point a finger at anybody else, but it just didn't work out. And I think Henry was just so mad about the whole thing that they didn't give it the proper attention, okay? And again, this was Henry getting really good and angry about investors telling him what to do. He just did not want to do that. All right, the Model N. Now, I attended a little webinar on Sunday without leaving the confines of my home, put on by the people at the Piquette Avenue plant, where all of these letter cars were produced in the first 12,000 Model Ts. They found a one-off Model N that was owned by the Ford Museum for many, many years, was sold when they got into financial trouble in the 80s. A gentleman in Colorado bought it. He sold it to somebody in Australia, where it stayed for many, many years. A gentleman who was in the webinar, or whatever they call these things these days, I'm not quite too sure. I still use the word blackboard, so, you know. But the owner was part of this too, and he lived in Canada, so the car is now back close by. It's a little Model N, looks exactly like that one, but had a 6-cylinder engine in it. There was one made, engine designed by Wills, okay? There was variable stories about why. Some of the historians there believe that somebody thought, well, the Model T fails, maybe we should have a backup. Maybe we have a 6-cylinder car, something more expensive. And after they noodled around with it, they built maybe 3 engines. They worked beautifully, but they never found their way into the T. They just didn't need it. The T did everything it was supposed to do by design. But they built one, and this was essentially a hot rod, okay? Now, they took the engine out, the little 4-cylinder at 15 horsepower. The owner of the car estimates that the 6-cylinder made somewhere between 35 and 40 horsepower. It added maybe 100 to 150 pounds. So now we have a car that's right around 1,000 pounds with 40 horsepower. Oh boy. Okay, so Henry, always being kind of a grandstander, would take this car out into downtown Detroit and demonstrate its skills to other car owners, mainly big cars. And he could run away and hide from 40 horsepower and 50 horsepower cars all day long, okay? Nobody could catch him. Today we call this street racing. And just as another little side note, the Piquette plant is 3 blocks east of Woodward Avenue. So you can kind of make that connection if you like. Okay, was this the beginning of street racing on Woodward Avenue? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, but they only made one. So, oh, and that, Henry's antics, it was never recorded if he ever got stopped for speeding or reckless driving or anything else. But all the policemen were on horses, so they're not going to catch him. Come on, right? All right. Plant number 2, where all of these letter cars were produced, Piquette Avenue in the corner of Beaubien. Henry's cars were doing very, very well, the Model A, and he was then allowed to build a brand new building, 3 stories tall, 461 Piquette Avenue in Detroit. All the letter cars were assembled here, and the T was designed here in the secret room up on the 3rd floor. There was no moving assembly line in this building at all, but Harold and an employee, Charlie Lewis, began studies on how to make it work just before they left and moved to Highland Park, okay? First moving assembly line was built in the upcoming Highland Park plant, but the first 12,000 Model Ts were assembled in this building. So there is one of the earliest that is owned by the museum. It's a 1909 model. The Ts came out late 1908. The building is still being restored, but I'll tell you, if you have any interest in Ford history, this and the Henry Ford Museum is the place to go. Believe me. They have at least one of every letter car that was produced from beginning to end, including the very earliest T's, okay? So if you take the tour there, the docents just love to talk about these cars and their progression and all of the things that they were learning as they were going along. And there's even a Model K in there, which I thought maybe Henry would have set fire to, but he didn't. It is absolutely a great place to visit, okay? And it is kind of at the edge of the Milwaukee Junction, I-94 and I-75. Okay. Here's a turning point. This is where we see Henry start to get a little gnarly. Beginning, Henry and Malcolmson always argued about what kind of cars to manufacture. Malcolmson, who held controlling interest of the company, wanted to build large, luxurious cars. He got his Model K. Henry's heart was set on a simple, well-made, reliable machine that would be affordable for the common man. Henry also didn't like rich people, although he became one of the richest people in the world. He just didn't like rich people. So now, using some underhanded tactics with the aid of James Couzens, Henry finally forced Malcolmson to sell him his interest of the Ford Motor Company for $175,000, July 12, 1906. Now Henry had complete control, okay? Henry Ford's company was Henry Ford's company. But this was ugly. This was really ugly. And I think it was a warning sign to Harold as to what was coming. Henry was starting to lose it. Oh, this is really cool. The experimental room. On the third floor of the Paquette Avenue plant, Henry instructed Charlie Sorensen to build a room. And there's Henry's quote, and I'd like to read it. It says, "Charlie, I'd like to have a room built right here to take this space. You put a wall around this and put a door big enough to run a car in and out and get a good lock on the door. When you're ready, we'll have Joe Gallum, the engineer draftsman. They put a drafting board in that room. Come up in here, we're going to start a completely new job." This was the beginning of Henry's dream, the universal car, the Model T. This was Henry's moment. Now we could start on exactly what he wanted. He had control. Okay? Key people who were in this room in 1907 and 1908, Henry Ford naturally led the charge. Joseph Gallum, Ed Huff, C.J. Smith, machinist, Charles Sorensen, Peter A. Martin, who was the plant manager at the time, and Child Harold Wills. The room is equipped with 2 large blackboards, a milling machine, lathe, and drill press. Henry had a rocking chair that belonged to his mother, from which he led the team. This process was described as cordial between Henry and the team. Okay? Now, during the days of Paquette, Henry spent most of his time out on the shop floor, up on the third floors where cars were assembled. There was no moving assembly line. Each car was assembled on sawhorses, and parts were brought to the car from the first and second floor. So it was clumsy, but Henry and Wills were always out on the floor trying to figure out better ways to assemble these cars. Okay, yes?
How did you get the car from the 3rd floor to the street?
Giant freight elevator. Okay? Now, the docents there, and I love these guys, they have all these behind-the-scenes stories. You would think, why in the world would you assemble the cars on the top floor? This makes no sense whatsoever, okay? All the raw materials and parts and everything and machinery and everything is all on the lower levels. So you would think the opposite. Well, it's a perfectly legitimate question. The problem was that the floors were not rated to carry heavy machinery, okay? Ground floor was for the heaviest stuff, okay, and all the offices, okay? Henry's office was on the 3rd floor. Please go visit this place. It is remarkable. It just leaks history. It really does. Okay, but during this time of building all these letter cars, Henry was a genuinely nice guy. It was with the employees, he knew everybody's name, okay? The building, they started, when they moved from Mack Avenue, they started with 30 people. Just a few years later, by 1909, they had over 1,500 people. They were building engines, they were doing just about everything in that plant, okay? So things started changing, okay? But it was always, hi Henry, how you doing? Slap on the back, hey Hank, what's going on? It was all very friendly and very cordial in the early days. That changed. First Model T prototypes left the room in spring of 1908. Probably too excited to drive, Henry asked an associate, George Holley. Holley carburetors, still in business today, fuel injection, all sorts of stuff. George Holley saved Henry's butt by providing him with a working carburetor that was so much better than what he was buying from somebody else. So they became fast friends. So he had George drive him downtown. Suspiciously, Wills wasn't mentioned in driving the Model Ts. I don't know why. First production Model T was completed on September 24th, 1908. Now we have to just jump very quickly to Highland Park, and this is where the moving assembly line started to happen. It took them 2 years to build a plant. It was designed by famous architect Albert Kahn. It was quite unique as it had a lot of glass, so you could see what you were doing. It was built on 102 acres, included offices, their own foundry, power plant, cold press building, which we call stamping today, machine shop, and assembly plant. Assembly plant was 4 stories tall, and the property covered 60 acres along Woodward Avenue. Portions of the plant are still standing today. The assembly building is clearly seen from Woodward. It's all boarded up, very bad repair. The rest of the place is just much like the Packard plant. It's just falling in on itself, and nobody's doing anything with it. Entire operation was moved from Paquette, where work immediately began on designing and perfecting the moving assembly line. Now, what we talked about earlier, yep, Henry Ford did all that in one day. Sure he did. There was a lot of people working on this. And it kind of makes historians cringe when you say Henry invented the moving assembly line. No, the moving assembly line came from many, many other businesses, okay? Gun industry. The famous story is the deconstruction assembly line in a Chicago meatpacking house, okay? Cow carcasses were hung on overhead hooks that moved through the building. Station to station, the cow was carved up. So somebody from Ford saw that and said, that looks pretty interesting. So it came from many, many directions, okay? Henry didn't invent everything. So once they got this all working, and it was a long process, took them 4 years, Model T production went from hundreds per day to thousands, okay? He was flooding the world with these cars, and he couldn't make them fast enough. So Highland Park opened its doors January 1st, 1910. They continued to make Model Ts until May 26, 1927. Etzel drove Henry out of the plant in the 15th millionth T, and that car is in the Henry Ford Museum. Okay? A lot of pictures, videos about that particular day. Very important day. An additional 450-odd thousand cars, Henry had, or the Ford Motor Company had, branch plants. They were cars that were shipped, Model Ts were disassembled, put in a crate, and shipped by rail to dealerships all around the country and eventually all around the world. There were 21 of these satellite plants in the United States alone. They did not do foundry work. They didn't build anything. They took the car out of the crate and assembled it. And so they were just assembly plants. They didn't paint anything. Okay, so that's how Henry's distribution network worked. Okay, very brilliant. Now, I don't have exact figures, and I wish I could track this down, but I tried. I suspect that Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy destroyed at least 1,000 Model Ts in their movies.
Yeah.
I'm sticking with 1,000. That's my story. My goodness, those cars, they became obsolete. And this is another thing that maybe everybody knows. But long about 1926, Etzel and all the higher ranking people in the company were begging Henry to do something else. Henry's mind was set in concrete, okay? He was not going to change that Model T. It was perfect. And because he was a frugal man, his vision was, that's all you need. You don't need an electric starter. Everybody in the industry had electric starters. Henry's car still had a hand crank, okay? And if you didn't know what you were doing, that hand crank would backfire and break your arm. Right here, okay? This became so common that the medical profession called it the Ford fracture. It's documented, okay? Happened all the time. Now, I crank started a T along with the owner who was, okay, my guardian angel, and what you see people do all the time, which is a horrible mistake, is to grab that crank and to wrap your thumb around it. No, 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 no. You do not want to do that. Get your thumb out of the way. So if this thing kicks, it'll kick easily past your fingers, okay, and you can get your arm out of the way. You see people doing this all the time. They grab that crank and they go, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, 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 no. If that thing does not start in a half a crank, you better find out why. Okay, cranking it like a madman is only going to give you grief. Okay, don't do it. My cousin and I, some years ago, went to the Gilmore Museum on the other side of the state, and we took a class on how to drive a Model T. Okay, very cool, very cool, right? So I learned how to drive a Model T. And what the people there tell you, the owners of the cars who volunteered to bring their cars and let the people drive them and give you instructions, and there's a classroom session, and it's all very serious. What they said was that the people who did not know how to drive a manual transmission learned the fastest. Okay? They had no muscle memory, they had no knowledge, because of driving a Model T is weird. You have 3 pedals on the floor, none of them are the gas. You have a 2-speed transmission that moves with a big lever and a foot pedal. So it is, I don't want to get into all the details, we'll be here all night, but it's just odd. But in the grand scheme of things, it was very simple. People learned very, very quickly. It was a simple car, okay? Not much to go wrong. They were tough little buggers. In fact, the docents at the Piquet plant kind of have their own little saying, Model Ts are like cockroaches. Okay? They're everywhere, and you can't kill them. You go to a car show, any car show, there will be multiple Model Ts there. People still love these things. So a couple of the biggest car clubs in the world are the Model T car clubs. Okay? You want experts? These are the guys. They dig in deep. Believe me, they know everything about a Model T. They probably know more about it than Henry did. Okay, now let's get back to Mr. Wills here for a minute. He was involved in everything we've been talking about. But these are his major accomplishments for Ford, and these are just the highlights. He designed the engines for all the letter cars and the T. He also designed the suspension, the frames, you know, everything. He designed the Ford script logo, as we noted. He redesigned the 2-speed planetary transmission, making it much better and a little tougher for use in the T. Here's a big one for people who know anything about engines. Engines were cast in one piece, okay? And it was reliable. Wills just didn't like that idea because it made the engine very difficult to work on. If you needed to grind the valves or do anything, you had to take the whole engine apart. So he designed the detachable cylinder head, which met with outrage. You'll never find a gasket that will prevent it from leaking. It's always going to leak, okay? Now, they found a company that made a great gasket. So that was another turning point for these little 4-cylinder flathead engines, and everybody started copying Wills, okay? So there's another legacy here, detachable cylinder head. Developed the Model T suspension. The uniqueness of the Model T suspension was not only the springs and the control rods or radius arms or wishbones, whatever you want to call them. The vanadium steel in the frame allowed the frame to flex tremendously and come right back to its original place. So between the transverse leaf spring in the front, these radius rods, and the flexibility of the frame, if you look at old film clips, there are people driving Model Ts through ditches at an angle, and the front end is this way, the back end is this way, and they just drive right through. The Model T could go just about anywhere, okay? If you like going 35 miles an hour, okay. He worked on the Liberty V-12 aircraft engine for World War I, mainly with metallurgical skills. Developed formula for the vanadium steel for application to Ford cars, which ran rampant, made him a very, very wealthy man because he patented everything. Worked on the Kettering Bug, a World War I armed drone.
Oh my.
Yeah, a little tiny airplane with a bomb on it that they just took off. They had no way to steer it or do anything. They just kind of aimed it. But the war ended and it never really came to be. Now, this is where he worked with Flanders very closely, worked with outside suppliers to develop better plant machinery. Remember, Henry wanted to be a manufacturer. He wanted to make his own parts. He didn't like suppliers. He thought everything was overpriced. He could make it himself cheaper. And he was right. He was absolutely right. Okay? Ford Motor Company made the Dodge brothers very, very wealthy. Okay? Very, very wealthy. And they ended up being competitors. They started building their own car. All right, and he worked on development of the assembly line for the Model T and many, many, many things. He was just a remarkable individual and a bit shy, okay? Henry could not get him in front of the press or to make a statement or do anything. He was a workaholic. Leave me alone, I got work to do, okay? All right, I've got another turning point here, a little warning to Harold. 1912, Henry took a little extended vacation. Things are running well at Highland Park, and Henry believed the Model T to be perfect and would not allow changes. Highland Park plant was running smoothly, allowing Henry to enjoy a lengthy vacation in Europe. Harold was getting bored. He didn't have anything to do, okay? I mean, Henry wouldn't let him touch the car. So Harold, along with the Dodge brothers, secretly built a new and improved Model T. You can see what's coming. Had many additional features, very advanced. They were so confident Henry would approve, they went so far as to order some new tooling and take a few advanced orders. Okay. This is bravery at its finest, okay? Upon his return, those involved showed Henry the improved Model T. Circling the car a few times, Henry exploded. He grabbed either an axe or a sledgehammer and promptly demolished the car where it stood. Okay? He would not allow changes to his beloved car and sent a warning that if this ever happened again, everyone would be fired. Now, clever Harold then patented all the new features without Henry's knowledge. Thank you very much, smart guy. He later licensed all of these features to the Dodge brothers for their new car. Okay? This guy, he just blows my mind. Okay. Now this is kind of, I guess, the beginning of the end. The Model T was being developed. Henry assigned Joe Gallum to take over all the engineering and drafting assignments. Henry told Harold to focus his attention on metallurgy, mainly molybdenum steel. Gallum succeeded Wills as chief engineer in 1914, but Harold was still deeply involved with metallurgy, machinery, and processes for mass production. James Couzens, the money man, the guy who kept the company going through thick and thin, left Ford Motor Company in 1915. Henry had these very strange pacifist activities. And one by one, we see the old guard is disappearing. Henry is buying out investors. He wants complete control, absolute complete control. Bought out in 1919, Ford bought out the remaining stockholders, and the Dodge brothers accepted $25 million for their 10% interest in the firm. The Dodge brothers stopped supplying parts to Ford in 1914. Henry started building his own engines in about 1908, but couldn't keep up with demand. So the engines were split between the Dodge brothers, and the Dodge brothers continued until about 1915 or so, producing engines for Ford of Canada. Okay, so the company was growing, and it just was running away. After World War I, distance between Ford and Henry, between Henry and Harold grew. This was part of the antics of Charles Sorensen. Charlie Sorensen was a brilliant man when it came to castings. He was also rough, hard to get along with, and just a general pain in the butt. Wills, he did not like the relationship between Wills and Henry, them being so close. He wanted that relationship, so he started giving Harold all kind of grief, and he was trying very hard to get Henry's ear, okay, over Harold's. But Wills didn't have anything to do. He was getting bored, and he was spending more time on his yacht, 140-foot yacht. And he was partying along with the Dodge brothers and a lot of his friends in the business. Walter Flanders, they were all big drinkers, every one of them. Henry was not. Henry didn't smoke, swear, drink, nothing. So finally, after all of these shenanigans with Sorensen, there was a confrontation, and this drove Harold to start renewing his efforts on building his own car, which he did, called a Wills St. Clair, another engineering marvel. So March 19th, 1919, Harold resigned, asked Henry for his share of stocks. Henry obliged, and Harold left with $1.5 million. Additionally, Harold's personal fortune was worth over $4 million. This is in 1919 money from his steel and other investments. So Wills worked for Henry Ford from 1899 to 1919, a period of 20 years. Now, according to the Consumer Price Index calculator, $1.5 million in 1919 today would be worth about $29 million. Okay, $4 million is worth about $72.5 million. So Wills was a very, very wealthy man for the time. What Harold did was a very important thing. In all of this, he built relationships with all of the suppliers, all of these knowledgeable people. He had a lot of friends in the industry. And these were his allies when it came time to build his own car. Okay? A little bit about Harold's wealth. It's always interesting. There's no secret he was wealthy. I mean, we just looked at the numbers. He worked very hard for Ford, and it paid off tremendously. Harold enjoyed his wealth. He wasn't a skinflint. Indulged himself with art, hunting gear, cars, beautiful waterfront home on the river. He had various speedboats. He tried his hand at boat racing in the early days of power boat racing on the Detroit River. The little boat was called the Baby Merrill. He owned a 140-foot wooden yacht named the Merrill, a combination of Mabel and Harold. Harold later joked he was lucky his second wife was named Mary, so he didn't have to change the name of the yacht. Harold belonged to many organizations, was a shrewd investor, made many, many friends in the industry, and really was a likable person. I tried for a long time to get a picture of his yacht. There's really nothing out there. You get a piece of it here or there. but it was quite extravagant. It was very extravagant, and that's in the Will St. Clair Museum. They have a scale model of it, so that's the best I could do. I didn't ask if it floated or not, but you know, there's certain things you don't ask when you're in a museum. Okay, so now Harold starts his own company, okay, and we're not going to get into all of that tonight because we'll be here till next Tuesday. But there is one book published on Childe Harold Wills, okay? I had to dig deep for all of this information because Henry Ford overshadowed everything. Ford Motor Company just covered all of these people up. And Wills just doesn't appear. Sometimes he's referred to as an associate, and that's about all he gets. You know, he did so much, but he made a lot of money doing it, okay? So he started his own car company from 21 to 1926. They built about 12,000 of them. No, he did not do it all by himself. He used all these allies, and he built a very nice plant in Marysville, Michigan, just south of Port Huron, okay? Most people don't know that. There is no remnant of the plant at all. It's an industrial subdivision now. The last building was torn down. It was a warehouse for Chrysler. Now it's a whole new building for Stellantis. It's a parts distribution center. Wills wanted this utopia type of thing because he built a neighborhood, churches, a hospital, housing for his workers. He treated them very, very well. He clearly understood the difficulties of putting cars together. It's a nasty job. Today it's a lot easier. But back then, working in a foundry in August, yeah, that's tough business. So the two, it's a very, very well done book. It talks about his part of his early life. It talked about the development of Marysville. A lot of people thought that Marysville was named after his wife. That's certainly not true. It was somebody else's wife. I don't know if Harold knew her or not, but the authors are Alan Naldrett and Lynn Lyon Naldrett, and they wrote the book for the Wills St. Clair Museum in Marysville. Okay, tiny little place. They have the largest collection of Wills St. Clair automobiles on the planet. 8. That's all that's left. That's all that's left. There's some in private hands. Jay Leno found one, and with his mega money and his big dog garage and all of his craftsmen, completely restored it, and it is stunning, absolutely stunning. Okay, so and he has a video. If you go into Jay Leno's garage on YouTube and search through, he has all kinds of videos on all of his cars and other people's cars. He does a very nice job, okay? But the car was a wreck. It was stored in a container in the desert, and it just fell apart, okay? So with this book and the help of the Wills St. Clair Club, he got the car back up and running, and it is stunning. It's absolutely stunning. So they wrote it for that book. I can't go into all of that tonight. But I would recommend a visit to their museum. If you have any interest in any of this old car stuff, his car was absolutely magnificent. But it didn't last very long because he kind of priced it a little too high, and it was a little too close to the 3 Ps, Pierce, Packard, and Pierce Arrow, okay? Those were very high luxury cars, around $5,000 range. His car started out as a mid-size car with a fabulous engine. Oh my God, this guy designed an engine that was just unbelievable, just unbelievable. But it was troublesome. It was too complicated. The mechanics didn't know how to work on it. So he designed a 6-cylinder after that and made it much simpler, and he did pretty good. But again, pure engineering genius. This guy was something else. Okay, so visit the museum, buy the book. It's a fascinating story. Okay, now, I'm a big museum buff. My wife and I have toured automobile museums for many, many years. We're still married. But she's patient, and she got a letter and a certificate from the Pope. It's kind of like a get out of hell free card. So no matter what she does, she's going to heaven just for being married to me. But the Will St. Clair Museum is in Marysville. I'm up on the screen, so if you want to take a picture of it. But every one of these museums is highly recommended. The Stahl Automobile Foundation is at 26 in Gratiot, okay? Limited hours, they're all on there. Automotive Hall of Fame, right next door to the Ford Museum. Go wander in there. Boy, there, you talk about your unsung heroes, they're all in there, okay? And great pictures and stuff. It's beautiful stuff. The Gilmore Car Museum, this is my favorite place. This is north of I-94 between Kalamazoo and Battle Creek. Way out of the way place. North America's largest car museum now. It's been growing year after year after year. Fabulous place, but it's big. I would recommend, it's 3 hours from here. So I would try to figure out how you can spend as much time as you can. I mean, if you stood and read every placard, you'd be there for 3 days, okay? But everything and anything, there's a Will St. Clair car there on display. So Henry Ford Museum, again, really fantastic. If you have not been there in a number of years, the whole automotive section has been redone.
Oh, really?
And now that, it's kind of funny, the Ford Motor Company no longer owns the Henry Ford Museum, and for many years. They are still big benefactors. The Ford family makes sure that, you know, they have plenty of money, but they don't run it anymore. So the new automotive exhibit, they've kind of redone the back half of it, is sponsored by General Motors. Okay, so I've always found that interesting. And then by all means, go to the Ford Paquette Avenue plant. This is ground zero. This is the place for all of these cars. And you will see the secret room. It is under construction, and they're working from blurry photographs, okay? They're doing the best they can, but if it's a secret room, who would be taking pictures of it?
Right.
There has been more nonsense published about the Model T paint, the all-black car. The paint came from Japan, certain colors dried faster than others. It's a mess. It's simply because people were kind of sloppy in their research, or they didn't research at all. So the paint came from Akron Varnish Works, founded in 1878 by two German men, J. Martin Beck and Edward G. Kubler. The company's product line consisted of wood varnishes and enamels. The company today is called APV Engineered Coatings. They are still in Akron. Little side note here, 1893, the safety bicycle was invented. This was the version that had two equal-sized wheels with a chain drive. The penny farthing, which was developed in England, had the big wheel, the little wheel. People were getting killed on those things, especially on bad roads. They were just flat out dangerous, okay? But once the safety bike came to be, the bicycle boom in the 1890s just exploded all over the world. Demand was very, very high. The company, Akron Varnish Works, reaped the benefits of this boom as more than half of the nation's bikes were finished with enamel from Akron Varnish Works. Half of millions and millions of bikes produced, okay? Now, I'm gonna steer the pot. This is my little, gonna become fact. The internet will do it for me. This is pure speculation, okay? Henry Ford was an avid cyclist, okay? He rode his bike all around Detroit. Well-known fact, okay? Now, was his bike painted with this paint? Got a 50-50 chance, okay? But did he recognize the durability of that finish on his bike? He liked that finish. Did he? Didn't he? Who knows? Again, pure speculation. So did this plant a little seed for Henry to go search out or have someone go search out that paint. Okay? It's all possible. By next week, it'll be a fact. Okay? We all know how that works. All right. 1912, the company was expanded to accommodate the fast-growing demands of the automobile industry. Henry Ford wanted the cheapest, most durable, fastest-drying paint available. Akron Varnish Works enjoyed immense prosperity, supplying a black Japan enamel, a high-temperature baking enamel. You had to bake it. It was enamel, oil-based. We rarely see that type of paint anymore today. Everything is water-based or latex, okay? But this baking enamel provided a smooth, shiny surface to the Model T. Now, very briefly, people have just beaten this to death. The paint came from Japan. It did not. It came from Akron. The Japanese were supplying to Europe and the United States little hardware parts, little clasps and things that had a very smooth, very black finish. The biggest thing that everybody talked about was mattress buttons. Okay, old-time mattresses had a button at either side and a string in between them. Very bright, shiny, looked very nice, okay? That is one theory. But they later found out that there really is no connection, any solid connection that the paint had anything to do with the country of Japan. It was just a name given to it, okay? So far, you know, maybe 10 years from now, somebody will find a real answer. But again, it needed to be baked. Now, the formula for this particular black enamel came with the founders from Germany, okay? The formula used tung oil, which is a cheaper replacement for linseed oil. If you've ever worked with, I'm an amateur woodworker. Some years ago, I learned my lesson. I coated a project with linseed oil, and it took 3 months to dry, okay? Geez, that stuff, it just doesn't dry quickly. I learned that you needed to buy boiled linseed oil. A lot of the things are boiled out of it, and it then will dry. Okay, lesson learned. The colorant, again, the pigment, is carbon black. We still use this today for inks, and it is a reinforcement for car tires. Okay, I can't get into the chemical analysis of all of that, but it's very cheap to produce, and that's what attracted Henry to it. They also added a product called gilsonite, which is a trade name. It is a mineral called uintate, and it is the basis of pure asphalt. So when you melt it, it's very, very shiny. And it adds a flexibility to the paint, especially in a Model T that flexed all over the place. And essentially, all of these early cars were basically four-wheel paint shakers, okay? You did not want your paint to crack from vibration, and this solved the problem, okay? So another attraction for Henry. Now, painting every single component on the Model T streamlined production when you used one color, okay? Quality control was more forgiving. This type of paint made it harder to detect variations in paint tone and easier to touch up. It eliminated the need for retooling the plant to accommodate for different colors. So very simply, one color streamlined the whole operation, okay? Very simple. Now, paint application on a Model T was pretty primitive. They would dip certain parts in a tank, and then hang it up to dry or run it through an oven, 400 degrees for 1 hour. They would brush it on, they would mop it on. They had a little short mop head. The guy would just slop the paint in, usually in areas where you couldn't see. And they just used a hose sometimes and just flowed the paint on, okay? Anything fast and dirty, get it out, okay? But it was a pretty good durable paint. Compared to today's paint, it was pure garbage. So now we're baking parts. Car bodies were not baked. The frames were wood. Pretty simple. I learned that the baking ovens were on the roof of the Highland Park plant. Safety reason.
Yeah.
You had a fire in the plant, that's the last thing you wanted. So you put the fire on the roof. Very simple. The rest, everything else was air dried. Now, there was a gentleman named Trent Buggus. He's still very, very active in the Model T Club. Fabulous researcher. He is a professor of economics at New Hampshire University in New Hampshire, Plymouth University in New Hampshire, and an avid Model T person. He went to the Benson Ford Research Center and did a seriously deep dive into the paint processes at Highland Park. He came up with some amazing stuff, okay? This type of paint was used for a while, but then it was superseded by better and, I mean, it was a continuous improvement process. And not all the same type of paint was used on the Model T as time went on, okay? So suspension parts were painted with one type of paint. Maybe a frame was painted with something, you know, he dug out all these work orders and work instructions, and it was a nightmare. He spent weeks and weeks and weeks. And what he did find, though, was multiple formulas from different manufacturers for different needs. And he could never find out any connection of this particular paint back to the country of Japan. It was just nothing there, okay? So everybody tells you that Model T paint, black was chosen because it was the fastest drying. You can give them a good poke. Okay, very briefly now.
The library is closing in about 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
We gotta wrap it up totally.
Okay, so we're going to flip the slide back. We have the technology. Okay, Professor. Yes, sir. Thank you.